Hi and welcome to Check Your Thread, the podcast that will help you sew more sustainably. My name's Zoe and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 14 years and I'm the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge Me Made May. But, like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and the way that my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me in this journey. So, what can quilt artists and other creatives teach us garment sewers about embedding meaning and connection into our work? I mean, the basic materials we use are the same, fabric and thread. Yet, I think that those of us who make our own clothes often treat our creations as we would a shop-bought garment. I wanted to explore the idea of adding meaning into our projects to increase our level of connection with and regard for what we make. And who better to get into the topic with than improv quilt artist Heidi Parkes? This is the second part of our conversation, so if you haven't heard the other one yet, pop this on pause, go back and listen to episode 105, and then you can come back for this one and it will give you more context. But first, I want to check in with you, lovely listener, and ask how you're doing today. Awesomely, I hope. I'm good. I've had a productive week. I spent a fair bit of this week planning future episodes and inviting people to record conversations with me. So much exciting stuff is on the way, I promise. So I'm still getting some lovely feedback from the recent episode on how to successfully shop for secondhand sewing machines. That was episode 104 if you haven't heard it yet. Bear and Lion on Instagram commented, "This is an awesome episode. So much good info. I've actually added to my calendar in January to start looking for a second-hand serger. It's been on my mind for over a year." I love that. Bear and Lion is clearly hoping to pounce on any bargains from people who receive new sergers for Christmas and they're selling off their older ones. I'm super impressed by that level of foresight, Bear and Lion. So what's on the old sewing table at the moment? Are you deep in a fun project? In between projects? What's going on? Since the last episode, I had a lot of fun making the Zero Waste trousers, which was from the Zero Waste Patterns book by previous guest Birgitta Helmerson. Birgitta spoke to me all about that book for episode 98, which was a super interesting conversation. So if you haven't heard it already, maybe it's a fun one to queue up for after this one. Anyways, I was using a piece of stretch denim from my stash that was technically a bit too narrow and technically a bit too short and technically a bit too thick for the project. I didn't have anything more suitable and I'm committed to using what I have. And I think I managed to make it work. It was a really enjoyable project and I definitely see more zero waste pattern projects in my near future. I've also been attacking a lot of small mends and alteration projects, like turning my son's trousers into shorts when the knees were all busted, and like adding a new little button loop on the cuff of my blouse, that type of thing. Next up on my sewing table are some little pouches, the kind of thing you might put makeup in. 1 or 2 are going to be for me, and the rest I think I'm going to give as gifts. I really think that participating in Meg Grandstaff's Scrap Busting September has helped me carve like a new habit where I work on something using scraps more regularly. I hope so anyway. Sustainability-wise, this week, as with many weeks, I got a whole load of products refilled via our local health food shop. They don't have a massive selection, but I got refills of body wash, hand wash, hair conditioner, and washing up liquid. Recently, I've been feeling super concerned about the amount of plastic that we're leaving on the planet for future generations to deal with. I really wish that more manufacturers would use recycled glass or recycled aluminium or at least recycled plastic for their product packaging. Especially the first two, because aluminium and glass can be recycled over and over. However, I do know that it takes a lot of energy to recycle those things. So really the best thing that we can do is skip the packaging wherever possible and use the things that we already have in existence. Hence me going to the refill store. If you're not sure where your local refill shop is, you could ask in like your local area's Facebook group or something, or you could try downloading the app called Refill. I haven't got it myself yet, but apparently it shows you lots of places in your location for refilling water, coffee, food, and plastic-free shopping locations. So why not see what you can refill this week? Okay, a lovely bunch of people have signed up to support the podcast recently. Many thanks to new patrons Bron, Heather, Danielle, and Biz. You are all amazing. The wonderful patrons of Check Your Thread help me pay the bills so that I can spend time making this podcast. If you'd like to support my work in the same vein and reckon you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month, please find the Patreon link in the show notes or on the website checkyourthread.com. Right, let's crack on with this episode. If you enjoyed last week's half, I think that this half of my conversation with Heidi is really going to knock your socks off. We explored loads of super interesting ideas, including whether your personal experience of clothing should factor into your decision of what type of career you have. Honestly, this conversation has left me with so much to think about, and I'm actually already working on another solo episode based on one of these themes. As always, lots of lovely stuff, links and pics in the show notes on the website checkyourthread.com. And sign up to the free weekly newsletter whilst you're there if you haven't already. Okay, so until next week, take care of yourself and enjoy. So when you're repurposing textiles in your work, do you prefer to kind of have had a relationship with that before? Or does that almost kind of limit you in some way? Do you know, because you've already got that relationship? Because I know, for example, you were talking about recently, you had a skirt that you used to wear a lot when you were a teacher, and then you've used that in a quilt of late.
Yes, that's a quilt that I made called But Was That Me? I made it either in 2017 or 18. Actually 2018 or 19. I have a very strong, deep preference for using specific materials that have a meaning or a story.
Oh, okay.
I don't like to just use a whole bunch of things from the Goodwill. I don't like it when they lose their identity or lose their story.
Okay.
So I'm often very specific. And in that quilt, I wanted to understand who was Heidi before and who is Heidi now, because I had undergone a very large transformation. It started with leaving my boyfriend of 10 years. And then 2 years after that, I left my job. And then a year after that, I left my state. And
wow.
Perhaps my first yoga teacher training was a catalyst for that. My training was with Ralph Gates, and he's an extraordinary yoga teacher. And that led to me being a very, very different self. And so that curiosity of who was I then, and how much of me is still the same and how much is not the same at all anymore, I was able to ask that question, something I was very curious about. And I felt part of what might hold that answer was that skirt. And it was one of those, when I was a high school art teacher, part of why I left that career was the realization that while I was very good at teaching was not very good for me.
Okay.
I learned when I was seeing a therapist that I am a highly sensitive person, and as defined in the book by Elaine Aron.
I want to read that. I heard you mention that previously. That sounds fascinating.
It's life-changing information. And I went through almost chapter by chapter with my therapist and watched everything on YouTube that I could find. And having a sensitive nervous system for me oftentimes means that I can feel my clothes more than other people.
I think the same. I think I might be one of these people.
Oh, yeah. It's the reason why I mend clothing. It has very little to do with the environment or sustainability. It's entirely selfish. It's just that once I get used to an article of clothing and I'm able to wear it, there's so much more benefit in continuing to be able to wear that garment that's comfortable than to have to try on new things and cycle through outfits. And at that time in my life when I was a teacher, I think I was forcing myself to have a job that didn't work with my body very well. I had to wake up a lot earlier than what felt natural to me. I had this sensory overload of trying to remember what was going on with 150 people whose names I learned fresh every 4 months. Yeah. And my brain just kind of couldn't handle it. I felt very overwhelmed, and simultaneously I was trying to dress very professionally. And a lot of times that meant, squeezing into things that felt a little more structured or a little less there's just a lot less ease in my body at that time in general. And in changing careers, I thought, if I'm an artist, I can definitely wear whatever I want. So I changed what I wore all the time. And so this particular skirt was maybe always a little too tight around the middle and never fit quite right. But the colors just melt my heart. This yellow polka dot on a creamy tan background is still so perfect. And so it caught my eye as something that was both so right and so wrong for me.
Interesting. Yeah.
And then being able to play with that juxtaposition and keep the color and the print and the things I loved about the skirt, but completely deconstruct and highlight the things that weren't working for me was very, very exciting.
I love that. That is so interesting. I did some episodes not that long ago about, it's obviously not the same thing, but about sewing for body changes and accepting that bodies change and we don't need to feel uncomfortable. Yeah, and I hope that people hearing your story then will then encourage people to go back to thinking about, well, if something's not working for me, like, how can I change this? Like, it doesn't have to be a quilt. It could continue to be a garment or it could be a quilt, but yeah, like, you don't have to get rid of the whole thing and start again, or you don't have to suffer.
I loved recently I listened to your episode with Kate, and in the Q&A, there were some great questions about matching your body, but this sounds like a different episode that you're referring to.
Oh yeah, that's a different one. It was before, it was, part of it was a bit of a pep talk, like, people, we don't need to feel uncomfortable in our clothing, and bodies are going to change, and it's not a failing if your body changes, because of course bodies change. Nobody's body stays the same. Be those changes, be them like, your monthly cycle, or even throughout the day, or over a season, or over a number of years. Like, how can we make clothing that still looks good, feels good, suits our lifestyle, but doesn't make us feel restricted, doesn't make us feel uncomfortable, or can be something that can be adjusted. It was a really interesting, what's the word? I don't know, like, it was like a challenge for me as well, to kind of think of loads of different ways and research loads of different ways to provide a lot of different options for people that they could then incorporate or think about incorporating in their projects. So it could be something that's literally adjustable, like it's a tie garment, so you can release it very easily from the morning to the afternoon. Or it could be something like if you're making a garment that's more fitted, but increasing, like using a larger seam allowance, for example, so that if you do find over a period of months you've changed shape, you've got more wiggle room, So yeah, it was an interesting kind of mind experiment,
Oh, I love that. I will have to listen to that episode. I find that is 100% why I so close for myself as well, is that the options available are simply inadequate and don't allow me to feel as comfortable as I want to feel.
So let's get into that. So how do you choose to clothe yourself?
One of the things that I like to do the most is if I've found a garment that's comfortable. For example, even the shirt that I'm wearing right now, it is a copy of a shirt from Anthropologie that's orange that I loved. It fit right. It allowed me to move. And so this one is made from a green dress from Anthropologie that my acquaintance Amanda dropped off at my house in a big black bag of things that were intended for Goodwill, but went to me instead. So I cut the skirt to be a shirt. And I think I have maybe like 6 copies of this shirt at this point. And I didn't have to do a lot of pattern fitting because I was able to just trace the very simple pattern of the original shirt and had that fit me. One of the top things that I look for in clothing is texture. I used to force myself to wear an underwire bra and then slowly started to wear less and less structured things. And eventually I just said, I hate this altogether. I don't want to do it anymore. And so in the absence of wearing a bra, I want to find clothing that has enough texture that I still feel as modest as I want to be. And initially that was like wearing a lot of carefully placed scarves. And then I got some better clothing options for myself. And now I'm able to do that. So a lot of times I will quilt clothing. I have a new quilted tank top that I made for myself a year ago. And it's my favorite garment that I own. It's a whole cloth quilt. So I just used muslin on the inside and then a beautiful mix of cotton and silk fabric that's black on the outside, and did some circular quilting on it, circles that overlap. And I love that tank top. It makes me feel so free and looking chic, but also super comfortable and happy with how I feel in that garment. I also like a lot of leggings. That goes back to my childhood. Even in kindergarten through second grade, I refused to wear anything but skirts and dresses. I wanted nothing to do with pants. And then eventually I would wear tights or leg warmers. And then finally I started to wear culottes. And then eventually by fifth grade, I was wearing stretch pants. And those are very comfortable. And I love the way that I can move in them, and they're not so restrictive. So
that makes me think of your yoga background also.
Yes. Also, I'm sure that's part of why I liked it. I'm sure I also considered that there were certain careers that just wouldn't work for me because I wouldn't be able to conform to the wardrobe involved in that career.
I love thinking about it in that term.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. We're not encouraged to think of things in that terms, are we? Like, what's best for my body? Who am I? You know, rather than what have you studied to do forever?
Yeah. And it's quite limiting too. Like, I loved theater when I was in high school and liked acting in all the plays, and you have to wear a costume that's very specific. And I thought, I don't think I would like the lifestyle of being an actress, number one, but also I didn't think that I would like being forced to wear whatever was appropriate for the character, and that would be a huge career problem. So I decided to follow my kind of equal passion at the time, which was art instead. And I feel like my inner theater kid gets to come out when I'm teaching, and I love to be on stage in that way, sharing things, hopefully being entertaining. But I very much choose things based on the texture and how it feels. I feel like now I get itched even by polyester is itchy to me. In addition to, of course, wool, even sometimes like cashmere can be really itchy, but cotton is my dearest and best friend, and silk also works great for me. So those are my top priorities with clothing. And then because I'm making things for myself and I don't want to invest tons and tons of time in it, usually I find something that fits well and then I copy the silhouette or the pattern of that.
Yeah,
so
we haven't got time. You've got too many quilts to make.
Yeah, exactly. I'm busy. I don't need every silhouette.
Time to do this.
And most of my clothes are pretty simple, where it's just a front and a back. There's not a lot of darts or pleats or other fancy things going into the construction. But that's what's been working for me lately.
Just going back to talking about the quilts that you make with repurposed fabric that you have a relationship with, maybe that's a garment that you've already had or some textiles that you got gifted. Do you find it harder to part with those quilts if it's got those things in? I mean, obviously so much of you goes into all of your work. Mm-hmm. Is it different in some way?
No, actually. And that's a great question. I don't think that does make them harder to part with if it's from my fabric. I think the quilts that are the hardest to part with are the ones where I have a big aha moment. And I learned something important about who I was as a quilter when I made that. I remember that moment of discovery, and I think that makes it more challenging. For example, there's a quilt called But What Was It Like? And it's a 3-foot quilt on a wooden frame. And normally when I'm sitting in my living room on Zoom, it's over my left-hand shoulder. And right now that quilt is on display in the Woodson Art Museum. It's not here at home. And I feel like I really miss that quilt right now. And it had several big moments of discovery for me. Discovery about diary quilting, about incorporating scraps and how they can stand in for the idea of settling for scraps of something, right? Scraps of attention, scraps of someone else's time, scraps of living my best life versus not, potentially. It was the first time that I repurposed my tiny little thread tails. I had found ways previously to repurpose fabric scraps, but I had been storing up my little threads in a ball jar, I'm sure inspired by Eliu and Zach. And then finally in that quilt, I thought, oh, I know how I can use these and put them into a quilt.
How did you do it?
I layered it under a silk scrim. So that quilt has a silk organza across the entire top, just a single cut. And all of the little thread scraps are underneath in this big tangled nest. And I love the way that it has this visceral feeling of maybe I'm confused at the moment or tangled, or adding an extra texture of trapunto where you would normally be putting cotton balls or fluff or extra batting or something in there, but to instead use that history of mine of things that I've made and the repeated cut. You use so much thread and then you have that 3 inches left at the end that you toss. And so it takes a long time to accumulate a big stash of that. And those discoveries in that quilt, as well as it's a quilt where I was looking back at a relationship, if you can call it that. I'd met someone on Bumble and liked them a lot, and we went on 2 dates, and I was keen to keep going out with them, and they like kind of couldn't be bothered. They weren't that into me. And it was a helpful quilt for thinking about, why did I have such a different impression of those 2 dates than that person did?
Yeah.
And also, if I'm looking for a partner, shouldn't the most important thing that I'm looking for then be someone who's really excited to go on a 3rd date with Heidi?
Yeah.
And if they're missing that quality, like, isn't that the biggest problem? Should that be really unattractive to me? And I was sort of confused about, well, why do I want to go out with this person again so much when they don't want to see me? Like, what's going on here? How can I rewire my brain? And so as I was working on that quilt, I was asking that question and thinking about that. And that's where the scraps come in of, I don't want to settle for someone who's only giving me scraps of their time or thoughtfulness. And that mental shift that took place with that quilt makes it very dear to me. I added an extra $1,000 to the price of it just to
buy it.
Someone has to really want it a lot in order to get that one away from me.
Yeah.
And, but you know, I would also be excited for it to find its next home because it is such a glorious quilt. So there would be a thrill in having it be sold and live somewhere.
Sure. This is so complicated.
But yeah, it's definitely that moment of discovery that makes them the most precious rather than a particular fabric that's gone into it.
That is so interesting. So actually, so much of what you've been saying and what I've heard you say before has kind of got me thinking about, I think that garment sewers, I mean, there's a lot of people that listen to this podcast that are both quilters and garment sewers. So either, you know, maybe they've started quilting and then got into garment sewing or vice versa. By the way, was there a clear direction for you? Did one come and then the other come, or have they always kind of gone, you've always kind of done both?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I was sewing clothes for myself first.
Right.
I remember, you know, as a little kid, I feel like I was growing out of things faster than they were wearing out. I remember I made my mom buy the exact same kind of shoes for me, same brand, same color, because I had grown out of the only ones that I liked to wear. And I was very lucky that they were still being manufactured. But by the time I got to junior high, I was so in love with being in home ec class. I always previously had loved art class the most in elementary school. And then I got into home ec and we were sewing and cooking and I just couldn't get enough of that class. And those skills that I learned, even though my mom had a sewing machine at home, I had never really used it at home. And in this class, I felt like I had all the tools and the help to learn how to sew. In high school, I did a lot of mending and I started to make some of my own clothes in high school as well, just because it, again, was solving a problem that was a pretty big problem. And then especially in college and art school, all the fashion kids are in the mix with all the other subjects. And one of my dearest, closest friends from college, his name is Matthew Lancy. He was in the fashion program. And so we would hang out as friends and work on clothing, or I'd see things that he made and reinvented. Yeah. So making clothes, I think, came first. I also did a lot of embroidery. That was another early textile for me.
Yeah.
And then when I was in college, I made quilts, but it was in my metalworking class, was my first quilt.
What materials were you using?
It has, thin copper sheeting in it, and it was sewn together with wire. And I also used book pages and a few bits of fabric. I think there's a towel in there, like fabric towel. The photographs are in that quilt.
Amazing.
And then I started taking textiles into my ceramics classes and my drawing classes, and I was pressing the textiles in or rubbing them or crocheting lace doilies around the edges of my drawings. And then finally, junior year, I took an actual fiber arts class. And there's kind of no turning back from that, but I still was making quilts out of books and paper and fishing line in those classes, and not ever a fabric quilt. So there's a big, long gap between 2003, when I started making quilts with quotation marks out of those materials.
Because you've been doing it for years.
Yeah. So that was like 2003. And it took me a decade till 2013 to make an actual fabric quilt. But before that, I made a lot of my own clothes when I was a high school art teacher too. That was a nice moment where I had some free time after school to do things that I was excited about. And sometimes that was painting, sometimes that was ceramics, but it was also making clothing.
Yeah. I love that making clothing for you has been obviously fulfilling a practical need, but also so kind of linked to your other kind of forms of expression as well, your other mediums as well, literally linked in some regards.
Yeah. Well, and it was absolutely inspired by my mother too. When I was a kid, she would sew a lot of clothes for me. And she would always share the story that when she was young, she was so poor that she had to sew her own clothes, which is such a different way of thinking about it from today. Now I have so much free time that I can sew my own clothes.
Absolutely.
Because I have an element of luxury in life to be able to do it.
And garment sewing can be, if done in certain ways, be quite expensive now. It is quite exclusive in some regards, isn't it? It doesn't have to be, which is something I try to explore, but yeah.
Yeah, my mother, she sewed a lot of things for me and used relatively simple patterns. So my mom could just take the same pattern and scale it up, use a different size of the pattern. So I could literally wear the same dress in first grade and second grade because she made it that way. But
it's kind of what you're doing now, isn't it, with your tops?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, I love that. So I've been thinking so much about how, since listening to specifically the episodes of the Craft Alliance, is it the Craft Alliance?
Yeah, Craft Industry Alliance.
That one really kind of got me having these thoughts, and I was listening to that and I was really thinking about how you have there's so much meaning and exploration embedded in your quilts. And I was thinking, I think that garment sewers really could learn a lot from you and from that kind of process of embedding more meaning into the things that we make. Because, sorry, how can I phrase this? I think that a lot of the time garment sewing, especially as it's portrayed on Instagram, there's lots of new sewing patterns coming out. There's lots of new fabric releases coming out. There's a big pressure, I guess, through social media to make a thing, show a thing, make a thing, show a thing. And it's almost like we're replicating the fast fashion kind of model of dressing ourselves, but we're doing the sewing bit. Whereas I feel like, obviously quilts are made from the same stuff as garments, it's fabric and it's thread. If we embedded more meaning, more kind of personal connection to the things that we're making, would we treat those garments better? Would we love them more? Would we feel a greater attachment to them? Would we be inspired to mend them or alter them or keep them with us for longer? Clothes, obviously, they probably don't have as long a lifespan as a quilt, But it's not a throwaway thing. We can keep them with us for years if we care for them well. So yeah, I was just wondering if you had any kind of suggestions, like be that like a mental shift or anything kind of practical that us garment sewers can kind of adopt to add kind of like layers of narrative and meaning into the things that we're making. I mean, it's a big question, but do you have any thoughts
Zoe,
on that?
I am in love with this question. It's so amazing. One of the first things that comes to mind that helped me reframe my relationship with clothing is that as a high school art teacher, I watched every single episode of PBS Art 21. I was completely in love with it. And one of the early episodes, it's Art 21 from PBS is about contemporary art. So if you go to the PBS public broadcast station website, you can stream all of the episodes for free. It's the most generous programming. It was an incredible resource for me as a teacher to show my students that an artist is something you can be now. I think a lot of art education stops with the Impressionists, and I wanted them to know that artists are alive and doing things today, and like you could go meet them or be one. And one of the artists that they interviewed was Andrea Zattel. She has two different lines in her work. One is around modular living and thinking about what is the minimum amount of stuff that I need to live. And so she has this suitcase that could also be a home, for example, or she made her own floating island and she lived on it. And this inquiry around what do you need. But the other ongoing project that she has is her uniform project. And she described that she was going into work every day at a gallery, working as a gallery assistant, and that they wanted her to look fancier or more special in some way. And she thought, that's kind of ridiculous to ask. They don't pay me enough to have that many fancy outfits. And so she sewed herself a simple black dress that had that elegant look that would work for her job and wore it every single day for 3 months.
I heard of this. Yes.
And at first she was very inspired by the Bauhaus. And so she didn't want to disrupt the warp and weft of the weave of the fabric. So she only sewed herself things made out of rectangles.
Right.
And then eventually, after several years of wearing only outfits made of rectangles, she started to crochet so that she could have other silhouettes and different kinds of dresses. But that idea of wearing the same thing every day. And then, of course, she has exhibitions where you can see each outfit in order. And what I wouldn't give to be able to attend an exhibition of that. It would be so exciting to me also to see the patterns of how things would get worn out would be so interesting.
Yes.
And the confidence that it takes to wear the same thing every day is really very interesting to me.
Because it's kind of the opposite of what society is telling us as women in particular to do, isn't it? Like, literally, I have a colleague who was like apologizing for wearing the same thing that she wore recently. It's like, what? You're apologizing that you have clothes that you wear? Like, that makes no sense. But the pressure is real.
Yes. And with social media, and especially when Facebook was new, to me, I think it was probably at its peak, for me at least, around 2010, this idea of, well, I've already been photographed in that outfit on my Facebook feed, so I should at least wear a different scarf with it next time. And to try to always have something a little bit new, or each time you're a guest at a wedding to wear a different dress instead of wearing the same dress you wore to the last wedding with the same group of friends. And her work, learning about it, completely changed my mind. And now I feel like I'm very excited to have the ease of a uniform. I think another creative and designer that inspired me that way is Michael Kors. At the same time, he was always a judge on Project Runway, and my mother and I would watch Project Runway together every Thursday night. So that idea of Michael Kors wearing jeans and a white t-shirt and a black blazer, not unlike Steve Jobs wearing the same thing, this streamlining where you don't get hung up. And I used to have so much anxiety about what to wear. and would try different things. And it would take me half an hour to figure out what to wear to some event because I had all these clothes, but I had no idea how to have them look right. And they had varying degrees of actually being comfortable on my body. So I would get an outfit and it would look good. And then I'd start to itch and then I'd have to rethink what I was wearing. So this idea of having a uniform and becoming more comfortable with this is an outfit that Heidi Parkes routinely wears. This is part of how I look, the same way that I have curly hair and bangs. And I don't need to reinvent that every time, but instead to celebrate the idea that that's part of me and part of how I bring myself to the world.
Yeah.
And it also cuts down on that decision fatigue, which I think is one of the biggest problems that my quilting students encounter as well, is when you could do anything in Heidi's class, what do you do? And so I try to have them lean into, well, what do you feel like doing? Or what technique do you already know and have comfort with? And how could you maybe repeat that? Or if you want to get better at appliquing circles, maybe applique a whole bunch of circles over and over and over again. And then that will be a beautiful part of your quilt. And also then you will gain skill and you'll have this visual record of gaining that skill on your quilt. But for me, it's that idea of reducing decision fatigue so that I can wake up in the morning and know I'm going to teach or be on Zoom and have 10 outfits that I feel really good about instead of 100 outfits that I don't know what to do with or how to rearrange.
Yeah.
So for me, yeah, that idea of what Andrea Zattel does and having a uniform and being really comfortable with wearing the same thing repeatedly is special. I think also in hand with that is mending and repairing clothing and mending in a creative or interesting way. I have a gray sweater from Target that I got probably over a decade ago. I know I bought it when I was a teacher of high school. It's starting to disintegrate, but it's a really fun task to just mend it a little bit every time it comes out of the washing machine and then keep wearing it. And it's becoming so colorful and beautiful. It might eventually be just darning and no more gray sweater. But that I find to be a very interesting relationship and adds new things. And my boyfriend, Bo, I've been with him for 3.5 years and he's a very fashionable man. He really dresses nicely. But Bo's gotten very excited about wearing mended clothing and he'll bring something to me and ask me to repair it. And he has this one pair of jeans that he likes a lot. And I think I've spent 20 hours mending them so far.
Wow.
And they're going to be on an exhibition at the James Watrous Gallery in Madison pretty soon. I'm going to drop it off in a couple days to the gallery. So it'll be up.
So he can't have his
fall.
jeans for a while.
Yeah. So he won't be able to wear his jeans for a while, but he has enough solutions. They're not for sale. I thought we don't have to work out who gets which percentage of what the jeans are sold for.
I've now been involved in these jeans as much as you.
Yeah, I know. He's a very savvy businessman. So he might be like, Heidi, those jeans belong to me. So I get But that idea, it's just been beautiful to see someone who is so into fashion and likes wearing new clothes also embrace wearing things that are visibly mended.
Absolutely, because you are a very talented mender yourself as well. What was your early encounters of mended textiles?
I would say certainly it was me mending my sweater back in junior high. I definitely was doing a fair amount of that. But at that time, I was always mending invisibly rather than visibly.
Right.
And then when I was in high school into college, I had a pair of jeans that were just chef's kiss. It took me a long time to find any jeans that I could wear comfortably. I only started wearing jeans in high school. And so I think it was probably the third pair of jeans that I ever owned. They just fit really great. They were from the Gap, but they had done that washing on them that made the fabric very fragile, especially on the top of the thigh. And I've learned over time that that's a place that I wear out a lot anyways. I think it's because I frequently sit with my knees bent, and that repeated bending of the knee puts extra tension on that part of the garment. Or it's that I always have a project in my lap.
I was going to say, all the quilts.
Yeah, there's a lot of abrasion that way. But I wasn't a quilter then. But I was in the ceramics studio, and so I'm sure I was always wiping my hands on my pants. But that was the first time I mended visibly. I would just run my sewing machine back and forth across the thigh to thicken up the fabric. They were such beautiful, beautiful men's. Almost every time that I mended them, I changed the color in the sewing machine. So it was like this rainbow. And then I graduated from college and I got a job as an art teacher. And I thought, I can't wear these to school anymore. They don't look professional. I have to force myself to wear something that looks newer, that looks, crisper, more presentable. And to my eternal regret, I threw those jeans in the garbage and I didn't even take a decent picture of them before I did so. And I think that speaks a lot to how my thinking has transformed between then and now, and also how the larger culture has transformed, where I was doing a lot of mending back then, but I was always ashamed of it. It was always a second choice. Like, because of my body and being so idiosyncratic, I had to mend. But I always felt a little embarrassed. Like, why can't I just be like everyone else, wearing new things, being a little more crisp? And then I think the advent of the fast fashion world got me to think about things a lot differently, so that I now mend things, and I'm very proud to wear the things that I've mended. But I think that the story of those jeans shows so clearly how I was visibly mending. They were so beautiful. And I was also so ashamed. And that growth and way of thinking about things differently, can transform. I feel genuinely proud to wear things like that now. And I felt genuinely embarrassed before. And it's great to see that society is changing a lot in their acceptance and excitement around mended things.
Absolutely. It's almost an act of rebellion now, isn't it? With new clothing being so cheap. Like, to mend something, it takes effort, it takes time, it takes skill, it takes a lot. It's not the easy choice, is it? It's quite, no. It's significant. Yeah. So you sometimes do mending for other people as well, don't you?
I do. Certainly. I mend for my loved ones. So Bo, my boyfriend, gets a lot of mending. And next to his jeans at the art gallery will be a pair of jeans that I mended for my dad back when he was alive.
So is mending your love language?
It definitely is. And, I think so much about, my dad was a very introverted person, and he was so proud to wear the jeans that I mended, and they would start a lot of conversations. People would say, "Oh, hey, what's going on with your knee?" And then he'd get to say, "Oh, well, my daughter is a professional quilter and she repaired these for me." And I just love thinking about him wearing his jeans and maybe his hand touching his knee, and then thinking, "Oh yeah, Heidi did that for me. She loves me. She cared about me." And I also mend for my nephews a lot. And one of the sweetest things to me, my nephew Colin was 2 years old when my dad passed away at the age of 69. And so we really miss him and are sad that he didn't get to experience his grandpa as an adult the way that my brother and I, all of our grandparents, lived into their 80s or 90s. I'm 40 and my 92-year-old grandma is still kicking in Florida. So anyways, one of the really beautiful things that kind of softens that loss is getting to still have my dad's jeans. And now my nephew Colin, I mend for him, and for both of them, it's always the right knee. And what a cool idiosyncrasy that they both wear their right knee to shreds and the left knee is completely fine. And I love that mending has allowed me to know that about them. And I might not have known that otherwise. Yeah. So anyways, I don't do a lot of mending for the public anymore, but I used to, and it was a great opportunity to learn about different bodies and the way that they wear things out. And now my preferred way, especially because just because I've mended something doesn't mean that it won't need mending again. A garment that's been mended once will probably in 3 or 4 months need a little more mending. And that's just how life is. That's how erosion works. And so I feel much happier teaching mending rather than mending as a commission, because I'm giving someone that tool to sustain their garment over and over again.
Absolutely. Like give a man a fish.
Yeah, exactly. And so this September, I'll be teaching a mending class on Zoom.
Cool.
With Erin Lewis Fitzgerald in Australia, and with Hikaru Noguchi, who's in Tokyo. And it's the coolest to be working with people who are in different time zones and different countries. And each of us will take a day. Erin's teaching about color and mending. Hikaru is teaching about texture, and I'm talking about time and how to think about time. And there's a lot of strategy in that. For example, a patch is faster than darning, where you're weaving with thread to cover something. And so having that debate of, do I want to spend a lot of time to mend this, or do I want to mend it faster? And there's a beauty in putting time into things. They always say that time is money. And so if you're mending something with gold, it looks beautiful. And like, what's more valuable than being able to see it was mended with a lot of time? But those practical reasons as well are really important, especially when you've got a busy life and you're working a full-time job and probably raising kids. And so that play between time and what you get out of it is going to be my subject that I'm really excited to highlight.
I love that you're teaching physical skills, but that you're encouraging people to think about the meaning and the layering and the interaction and the ongoing relationship with those items as well. I think that's something that I'd like us all to think about a bit more as well. I have adored talking to you. I've already taken an extra 20 minutes of your time, so I'm sorry about that. Thank you so much for this. It's been so exciting to speak to you.
Zoe, thank you. It was such a pleasure to be on. I've enjoyed participating in Me Made May for so many years, and to get to talk to you and connect is such a special treat. Thank you.
Thank you. So where can people find you?
Everything that I do is with my name, Heidi Parkes. The big trick is spelling Parkes, Parkes. And you can find me as Heidi.Parkes on Instagram, on YouTube, Heidi Parkes, on Pinterest, Heidi Parkes Art. And I've been doing a lot of fun Pinterest boards lately. I have an intern, and she's been hunting through all of the things that people have made in my classes and compiling them.
Oh, wow.
So for example, my quilt patterns, several people have been even taking my quilt patterns and putting them on clothing. So there's a jacket with my pattern and a dress with my quilt pattern, and they are totally incredible. So Pinterest is a really fun place that has a lot of fresh activity on it from me. I've joined Threads. I have 4 photographs on there now, and that's Heidi Parkes, Heidi.Parkes also.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful for your time. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!